Okay. Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you who are now on this webinar. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Global Elk Coalition on the FATF for this webinar with the beautiful title, ABCs for Risk Assessment of the Non-Profit Sector in Your Country. Just a short introduction to the webinar. What can we expect? We have three terrific speakers who will speak shortly, and it will be on the revised Recommendation 8 of the FATF on non-profits, which was done in 2016. And from this revision onwards, countries now must conduct a terrorist financing risk assessment of the non-profit sector. The Financial Action Task Force requires government outreach to non-profits for these assessments, which are supposed to be shape-targeted, proportionate measures that only apply to NPOs at risk. Now, the issues we would like to talk about this afternoon are: how are governments and NPOs dealing with this process? How do risk assessments affect regulations of NPOs? How are they done? And how can NPOs impact the process? So before giving the floor to our speakers, which are Ben Evans, Yann Desclercs, and Andrew O'Brien, whom I will introduce with more details later on, I would like to switch over to Kay to share a few things on the protocol for this recording. Kay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leah. This is Yann with the Charity and Security Network. I just want to let you know a few things about asking questions and using the chat box in this webinar tool. You should have on your screen a box with a number of icons and options. If you look at the bottom, there will be a little arrow next to the word chat. Click on that. It will show your options for chat, and you can chat among yourselves during webinar that way. Above that, there's one that says questions. Click on that arrow, and that has a question box where you can type in your questions. We will have several opportunities to ask questions during this webinar, one after each speaker, and then one after the general discussion. You type in your questions there, and then I will read them out. Thank you. I look forward to hearing the speakers.
Okay, the first one is Ben Evans, who is co-founder and senior associate at the Greenacre Group, and formerly Ben was with the UK Charity Commission. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Leah. And hello, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. I have a handful of slides. I've been asked to speak to give some background and context on the Financial Action Task Force and how that relates to non-profits, and specifically where the risk assessment requirements come in. So if we can go to the next slide. I apologize to those of you who already know about the Financial Action Task Force, but I'm guessing that maybe some of you don't. So briefly, I'll explain what it is and what it does, and then we'll get into why that's important to the work of civil society. The Financial Action Task Force is a global body, and it's the standard setter for rules on money laundering and terrorist financing. You often see these initials AML or CFT, which relate to these issues, and in particular CFT, or also sometimes TF, which stands for terrorist financing. Those are the concerns of the Financial Action Task Force. The Financial Action Task Force, or FATF as it's known, has over 190 countries and territories as members who are committed to implementing the standards and rules that it sets. Can we have the next slide? So what are those rules? Well, there are 51 of them. There are 40 what are called recommendations, which cover technical compliance, and 11 what are called immediate outcomes, which measure effectiveness. All of these rules are tested, they're assessed through a process called a mutual evaluation process, through which every one of the 190 countries, which is a member of FATF, will be assessed by other countries and international bodies for how well they're meeting the requirements set out in these 51 rules. This is not a one-off event. The evaluation happens every 7, 8, 9 years, but countries there will be follow-up for countries. So where they have done badly on a particular requirement or recommendation, they will be expected to show their progress. And countries which do badly overall can face genuine consequences. Consequences which range from having a higher risk rating in the international financial sector, which leads to difficulties in banking and higher costs and borrowing costs, through to, at extreme examples, sanctions being placed on those countries. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, how does that affect civil society? Well, there are 51 rules, as I've said, and one of the recommendations, recommendation 8, specifically deals with non-profit organizations, or NPOs, which is the terminology FATF uses for the civil society sector. And also immediate outcome 10, which looks at effectiveness, partially concerns non-profit organizations. Can we have the next slide? Let me just speak briefly about, in general, how FATF approaches its work. It takes what it's called a risk-based approach, or RBA. And here you'll see the very first thing that FATF says in terms of its recommendation is that countries should identify, assess, and understand their risks and take action aimed at ensuring they're mitigated effectively. So that's the fundamental basis of everything that FATF does. But it's also worth noting a point that's made in the accompanying note to recommendation 1, which says that where countries identify a lower risk in a particular area, it may be appropriate for them to take simplified actions or simplified measures. So how does this affect civil society in practice? We'll go to the next slide. As you can see here, and this is an official FATF publication again, FATF recognizes that not all NPOs are high risk, and some may represent little or no risk at all. Can we go to the next slide? This slide, therefore, represents a simplified version of how FATF rules apply specifically to the civil society sector. And it all follows this risk-based approach which FATF follows. So in the first place, every country is required to do a national risk assessment, or NRA. That looks at the entire economy, everything that happens within the finances of a country, to assess the specific terrorist financing or money laundering risk. Once they've done that, part of the national risk assessment will be to look at, amongst other things, the non-profit or civil society sector and consider any terrorist financing risk there. Countries are then expected to undertake a sector risk assessment for the NPO sector, so specifically looking at the risks in the NPO sector. And once that's completed, they need to consider their mitigating measures. Let's go on to the next slide. So this is the full text of recommendation 8 and what it says. But if we go to the next slide again, straight away, we can see highlighted the key text for our purpose. So next slide, please. Which is here. As you can see, recommendation 8 requires countries to identify which non-profit organizations are vulnerable to terrorist financing abuse. Now, there's two key things to note here. First of all, recommendation 8 only covers terrorist financing. It does not apply to money laundering, and money laundering is not something that will be considered when countries are assessed. Secondly, it's not about identifying the level of whether the non-profit sector is at risk as a whole. It's about identifying what kind of non-profit organizations may be vulnerable to terrorist financing abuse. We see more detail. If we go into the next slide, we see more detail in the methodology. The methodology sets out exactly what it is that evaluation teams will be looking for. And again, if we go to the next slide, you can see the key points highlighted here. So this is specifically what countries will be expected to do. First of all, they need to identify which subset of organizations fall within the FATF definition, by which they mean which subset of organizations are potentially at risk of terrorist financing. They also need to identify the features and types of non-profit organizations which, by virtue of their activities or characteristics, are likely to be at risk of terrorist financing abuse. So that's the specific thing that the risk assessment should be looking at. We go to the next slide. That's fine. Yep. Go back there. Sorry. Next slide. Also, countries should be looking to identify the nature of the threat that terrorist entities pose to non-profit organizations and the ways in which terrorist organizations may abuse non-profit organizations. Okay. So what does FATF say about how this process should be done? Well, if we look at the next slide, we can see. Next slide, please. Thank you. Basically, very little. I would emphasize that FATF does provide large amounts of guidance on all of its recommendations, including on recommendation 8, literally hundreds of pages. But despite that, all you can find is these two paragraphs which tell you what should be covered in the risk assessment. And the first one is perhaps the most interesting, because as it says that the risk assessment could take a variety of forms and may not even be a written product. So very little guidance or detail from FATF on what a risk assessment of the NPO sector should look like. However, there has been some guidance given by, or some feedback from FATF, which can be useful. If we go to the next slide, please. There was a FATF event in Vienna last year, and there was a side event where some FATF officials attended and gave some clarification on what they were expecting risk assessments to cover. These were the four main points that came out. First of all, that, as they've already said, many forms of risk assessment are possible, and FATF doesn't have a preferred methodology. What they want is for a country to be able to demonstrate that it knows what its risk is and how it will address that. The second thing FATF emphasized was that countries should update their risk assessment periodically because risk changes, and so they need to be adapting and identifying new risks. Third, they recognize that risks within countries can be different from one region to another. And fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, they recognize that they emphasize the need for consultation and inclusiveness, by which they mean with the civil society sector in any risk assessment in order to get a good result. So what is my penultimate slide is to look at how this is playing out in terms of evaluation. If we go to the next slide, please. The European Centre for Not-for-Profit Law, ECNL, have done some assessment of mutual evaluation reports. And the most significant finding they had was that risk is at the core of how recommendation 8 is assessed. In other words, you have to do a risk assessment. You have to do a good risk assessment if you want a good score on recommendation 8. So final slide, just to summarize the main points then that I've wanted to try and get across here. So FATF is the body that sets and assesses the global rules on both terrorist financing and money laundering. One of those rules relates specifically to the terrorist financing risk in the NPO sector. That's recommendation 8. FATF takes a risk-based approach, which for NPOs means that governments have to show that they understand what kinds of NPOs are at risk, what categories of NPO are at risk, the features and types of activities that put them at risk, and the nature of the threat that they face from terrorist financing and how terrorists have abused them. But in practice, there's little guidance for countries on how they can meet this requirement. Okay, so that's the end of what I wanted to say. Are there any questions? I guess they would come from UK or from Leah?
Are there, yes, we have a few minutes for clarifying questions or other sort of questions to Ben. So I'm not sure, Kay, whether some questions have been typed in or people can also just post the questions now to Ben.
Yes, please type in your questions for Ben in the question box. Right now I don't see any, So please feel free to do that. All right, we have one from Development Watch in Pakistan. Excuse me, I just need to open up the question where I can see it. Okay, I don't see the entire question. As you mentioned, there is no guidance from FATF. What is the best way, in your view, to start the process?
Well, good question. Yes, there is little guidance from FATF. To say there's none isn't quite fair, but there's very little. The question is, I think, different, obviously, if you're government or civil society. For civil society, it's not so straightforward because FATF have a definite preference. In fact, it's essentially a requirement for FATF that governments do the risk assessment themselves. I think the best thing that civil society can try to do is to be involved in that process. We know that FATF want to see consultation, want to see stakeholders involved, and that they think risk assessments that are done with civil society involvement are better. So I think, without knowing which country this question is coming from, I think the first step that civil society should take is to start speaking to their government. Try to find out which part of government will be responsible for completing a risk assessment and see if they can contribute to that risk assessment in some way. Because not only will that, I think, produce a better rating when it comes to their evaluation, but I think it will also result in a more accurate risk assessment and one that is more sensitive to the concerns of civil society and less likely to lead to outcomes which could restrict or restrain civil society in some way.
Thank you, Ben. Are there any other questions for Ben?
Thank you, Ben.
Okay.
We see no further questions. We can move on.
Thank you.
Next.
Yes, let's move on to the next speaker. I would like to introduce Yann Desclercs, who is speaking from Senegal. Yann is Managing Director of Cornerstone Advisory, and he was formerly Chief Compliance of Citibank West Africa. Yann, on to you. How to do a risk assessment from your experience. Do share it with the audience.
Thank you very much, Leah. Thank you. So, hi everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to try to take you through the basics of how to do a risk assessment in general that could then be applicable to the NPO sector of your country. I will start this by actually positioning the risk assessment exercise as a project, because indeed it's a project. As Ben mentioned, it's usually, and the best way to approach it is to actually do it as part of the national risk assessment of your country. But even at the sectoral level, it should be handled as a project. Therefore, I strongly encourage that you apply all the project management skills that you have within the NPO work group that you will constitute to conduct this exercise in your country. And also, as per all good projects, you should have a strong planning phase during which the purpose should be clearly defined, the purpose of the risk assessment exercise, clearly defined and understood by all project team members. And then based on this purpose, the work group during the planning phase should produce a customized methodology, customized to your NPO sector in your country. And I personally call this document, in the context of a risk assessment, an orientation document. This document is nothing else than a methodology document that is calibrated to your specific situation and that should guide you along the entire risk assessment exercise. The orientation document should contain at least the objectives, the series of activities to be done as part of the process, the timelines, the types of data needed, the source of those data, the collection means of those data, the methodologies to analyze the data, and the deliverables expected from this exercise. And as you can see in the current slide, I'm also strongly suggesting to add a quality assurance program to the risk assessment process of your NPO sector. But for the purpose of this webinar, we will focus on the activities or stages of a risk assessment process, that are identification, analysis, and evaluation. Also, as per some FATF guidance that I have came across. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll go through the first activity, which is identification. The process of identification in the context of the risk assessment starts by developing an initial list of potential risk or risk factors, but those risks will derive from a list of suspected threats and also a list of vulnerabilities, because in the context of the ML, money laundering and terrorist financing risk assessment, the risk is derived from threats and vulnerabilities. In order to understand this identification stage, we need to go back to some basics. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. In the context of the risk assessment, the risk can be seen as a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. But at the identification stage, we will focus on threats and vulnerabilities. In summary, to summarize this slide, in order to identify your risk, you need to list all the threats that you can think of, all the vulnerabilities that you can think of, and link them up together to come up with your list of risks. And in order to properly understand, the threats in this context can be defined as any factor or any type of person or group of persons that can potentially cause harm. And in this specific context, it includes criminals, terrorist groups, their facilitators, their funds, as well as past money laundering and terrorist financing activities. And vulnerabilities can be considered or looked at as weaknesses in the controls or systems in the anti-money laundering and counter-finance terrorism of your country that will actually facilitate the realization of the threat. So, as I just mentioned, to derive your risk, you need to list your threats, your vulnerabilities, link them up together to some risk factors that will then be your ultimate list of risks for your RA exercise. In the next slide, in the next two slides, I have just provided some examples of how you can collect the data on your threats, vulnerabilities, and risks. The actual process used to identify can vary. Some may use some formal techniques, like the one I illustrated on this slide, like questionnaires, quasi-statistical analysis of past events. And other countries may choose to have a number of experts sitting on a table or around the table and brainstorming based on their expertise in order to list the threats, the vulnerabilities, and link them up to the risk. Next slide, please. This slide already mentioned the fact that the risk is derived from threats and vulnerabilities, but I have focused one slide on this to insist, because from my own experience, this step is usually neglected during the national risk assessment or even sectoral risk assessment. So it's very important to link the threats with the vulnerabilities that facilitate them, with then the risk factors that they are related to. So it's very important to go through that step in identifying your risk. Next slide, please. In the next slide, we will go through the analysis, the risk analysis, which is the next activity. After identifying your risk, you need to analyze your risk. And at the analysis stage should aim at determining the size and seriousness of the risk in relative terms to other risks. The goal of this step is to analyze the identified risks to understand their nature, their sources, their likelihood, and consequences in order to assign some sort of relative value or importance to each risk. We can move on to the next slide. Okay, so there are different ways to analyze the risk. Again, some countries may decide to have a number of experts sitting around the table and categorizing their risk in terms of importance based on their own experience via workshops or group discussions, or they can use more formal analytical techniques such as surveys, such as statistical data to determine the consequences and likelihood of the risk, materializing into an actual risk, and combining the consequences and the likelihood via a matrix to actually evaluate and quantify the risk. Next slide, please. We can move on to the next slide. And this leads us to the next slide on the risk evaluation. So if your country decides to use a more analytical method, you should then quantify your consequences, the likelihood of occurrence of the risk, and then combine the likelihood and consequences into a matrix in order to quantify your risk. And please note that the FATF guidance includes this matrix at the analysis stage, but based on my own experience on risk mapping in general, not only related to money laundering and terrorist financing, I actually suggest, as I did in this presentation, to move this matrix to the evaluation phase, because for me, evaluation is tied with quantification, and this is what this matrix helps us achieve. I've illustrated this in the next slide. Next slide, please, the matrix. So to show you that actually the risk quantification is a function of consequences and likelihoods. Next slide, please. Okay. And also, I've added a fourth activity, which is actually the risk management, because in the FATF guidance that I came across, there is identification, analysis, and evaluation. I've added a fourth step, which is risk management plan, which is actually not part of the FATF guidance, but I added it to my customized methodology. It's not missing from the FATF guidance, but it's included in the evaluation phase. But I decided to distinguish it from the evaluation phase because it's the phase, the stage where you actually take the result from the evaluation and actually try to come up with a plan to either avoid the risk, to prevent it, or to mitigate the risk, or to reduce the risk. So during this phase, based on the evaluation phase, you will prioritize the risks. Next slide, please. Based on the matrix that I took from the FATF guidance, as you can see in this matrix, medium risks with a high consequence you should address as soon as possible. Higher risks, of course, should be addressed immediately. Medium risks with low consequences should be addressed in due course, and lower risks should be monitored until there is a change in their quantification and in their categorization. Addressing them means putting up an action plan together to actually prevent the risk or reduce the risk. And this matrix can help you achieve that. Next slide, please. Okay, so in summary, the risk management phase is actually meant to put together, as I just mentioned, some actions to either prevent the risk, to mitigate it, accept it in the context of money laundering and terrorist financing. it's not very actually applied, because we're really trying to prevent the risk or to mitigate the risk. And in summary, I have put up in conclusion, next slide, in conclusion, I'm concluding with this figure that illustrative figure of the process that I took from the FATF guidance. And in this figure, there are only 3 stages. I have added a 4th stage, but all the points that I've mentioned are represented in this figure, in those 3 stages. It's just that in the methodology that I suggest, I actually allocated the different actions within 4 stages instead of 3 stages. So it's very difficult to go through how to do a risk assessment in 10 minutes, but at least it can give you some basics, and if you have more questions, I'm more than open to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yann, for this very comprehensive presentation. Kay, are there any questions in the text box?
Yes. There's a question.
Go ahead.
What are the tell signs that indicate whether a risk is low, medium, or high?
Excuse me, Kay, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. What are the tell signs that would indicate whether a risk is low, medium, or high? Are there particular factors that would flag risk at one level or another?
Oh, okay. Actually, it's the consequences. You need to measure the impact of a risk. If there is a risk that has, if it materializes, it will have catastrophic consequences on some aspect of the NPO sector of your country or your country in general. And also, after measuring the impact, you need to measure then the likelihood or the probability that the risk will materialize. If the consequences or the impact is high and the probability that the risk will materialize is also high, then this risk should be considered a high risk and quantified the highest grade possible, and should be managed immediately. You should have an immediate response to the highest risks that have high consequences and high likelihood of occurrence.
The next question is, who is responsible for the assessment of risk among nonprofit organizations or from nonprofit organizations?
Actually, as Ben rightly pointed out, it's good to do it within the context of a national risk assessment process of your country. And the national risk assessment of your country is usually coordinated by your local country FIU, Financial Intelligence Unit, by either a ministry decree or a presidential decree that appoints the national FIU as the national coordinator of the national risk assessment. And the coordinator of the national risk assessment exercise, the local FIU, will then put up together a national work group. And in putting together this national work group, they should invite the NPOs in this group. So the NPOs invited through the association of NPOs, or depending on the different countries, they will have different stakeholders in the NPO sector that will represent the other NPOs and that will be responsible to conduct the NPO risk assessment within the national risk assessment process of your country.
And the last question is there a risk assessment checklist that NPOs can use in this process?
Well, as Ben mentioned, there is very, very little guidance on the NPO risk assessment. I went from the FATF guidance and used my own experience. So from what I know, no, there is no checklist. But for countries that are interested, they can actually work on putting up together a checklist based on the basics that I have just exposed on the methodology. And yes, I will be more than happy to assist those who have further questions to help them develop, and I guess the other presenters as well, to put up together a checklist on the NPO sector, at least as a starting point. But as Ben also mentioned in his presentation, this is a dynamic exercise. So you can start with a checklist that is as comprehensive as it can be at this stage, and you can, it can keep evolving, you can keep updating this checklist as you have more knowledge, as you build knowledge around this process.
Thank you. Thank you, Yann.
You're welcome.
If there are no more questions for Yann, let me hand over to Andrew O'Brien, Director of Policy and Engagement of the Charity Finance Group in the United Kingdom. And Andrew will share with us his experience with the risk assessment conducted by the non-profit sector in the UK. Over to you, Andrew.
Hello, hope people can hear me. Yes, so just to give a bit of background about myself, I'm Director of Policy at Charity Finance Group, and we're an umbrella body, so we represent charities on finance issues in the UK, and I've been engaged in this process now probably for about 3.5 years. So we were motivated to get involved in this because of the impact of bank de-risking on the NPO sector in the UK. So if we go to the next slide, what I can do is just talk you through basically how we got to where we got to. So the UK was going to have a mutual evaluation, as Ben has discussed, one of those evaluations that takes place every so often to see how rules are being implemented within countries. We were having ours in 2018. We should be having it very shortly here. So last year, in about March time, the HM Treasury, which isn't the Financial Intelligence Unit, that's the National Crime Agency in the UK, but I think the Treasury effectively took the process over and from a policy level delivered it. They began compiling or gathering evidence for their national risk assessment. So they reached out to us, they reached out to other charities they knew, they reached out to our regulators, the Charity Commission, to try to gather evidence on this issue. And then in spring, summer, we had some conversations. We had a roundtable meeting which we hosted between NPOs and the government to look at the risks facing the sector. And we also submitted our own written evidence as well, which was an exercise that I'll talk about a bit later. And then in October 2017, we had our new National Risk Assessment published, which reduced the risk of NPOs from what had been medium-high across the sector to low risk, and also mentioned that it might be higher risk, but not high risk, for charities which are operating in places like Syria or Yemen or those areas of conflict. So if we go into the next slide, again, as I said, I'm from an umbrella body, so I'm effectively a lobbyist, and how I approached this was, what did we want to get out of this from our members' perspective, but from the wider NPO sector's perspective. So when I discussed that with our colleagues in the sector, what we came up with was a kind of list of priorities. The first was we wanted a more nuanced understanding of the risks facing NPOs. I mean, one of the great things about the change to Recommendation 8 was that it reinforced the fact that the whole sector is not the same, and not all organisations should be considered high risk just because a few organisations might pose a higher risk. So we wanted that reflected in the National Risk Assessment. We also wanted recognition of the fact that in the UK, certainly, we have a lot of regulation for charities and NPOs already. So we have about 150 years worth of law and legislation and court practice which dictates how charities should run themselves. Charities have to file a lot of paperwork on a regular basis, and that wasn't really reflected in previous assessments of risk of UK NPOs. So we wanted that to be taken into account. We also wanted a context for the level of abuse and risk as well. So in the last National Risk Assessment we had in 2015, the government basically highlighted a couple of cases, legal cases, and then said, oh, well, the whole sector's medium-high risk as a consequence of these two legal cases. Well, there are 167,000 charities registered in the UK. There are then hundreds of thousands of small community groups which aren't registered. We've got thousands of universities, schools, etc., which are also not regulated by our charity commission, but which are charities. So a handful of cases in the context of hundreds of thousands of organisations doesn't seem like an effective way of measuring risk. So we wanted that to change. So to feed into this, we decided to put together our own evidence gathering and risk mapping process. So if we go to the next slide, how do we do this? Well, I'm quite lucky. So, I did write our written response and I organised some meetings, but I'm very fortunate that I have a lot of colleagues in the sector who discuss these issues regularly. And we have a formal counterterrorism and sanctions group, which we co-convene with another organisation called BOND. And that brings about 15 or 16 interested NGOs and the kind of risk managers and legal counsels at those organisations. So we already had a body of evidence and expertise that we could draw on. So we weren't starting from scratch. We'd also made sure that we tried to understand the motivations behind the officials that were running this process. So I've got to be honest, most people that do national risk assessments will not know anything about NPOs or civil society. That's not their expertise. So when we first met with them, we found that they did not really have any understanding of our sector, the law, how we operated in practice. So what we needed to do was to understand where they're coming from. And then what we wanted to do in our risk assessment was basically every point of concern that they had, we wanted to gather evidence to show that they shouldn't worry about it. So we did that through a survey, which we ran of NPOs, and we asked them basically to be as detailed as possible about what they were doing to mitigate the risks which government felt were facing the sector and what good practice looked like. And then that way we could kind of throw that back at the government. So if we move on to the next slide, as I said, we found out that there was a real lack of understanding in government. We also found out that actually NPOs, when we surveyed them, were doing a lot of due diligence work. They were monitoring their partners. They were checking against things like WorldCheck and sanctions lists. They were ensuring that their partners and their staff were being properly vetted. They were trying to use formal banking channels wherever possible. They were doing impact evaluations and other evaluations for funders. So there was a lot of due diligence and compliance taking place in our sector, which obviously makes them harder to be abused and also meets a lot of the concerns which government had, which was they thought that we weren't doing any of these things. I think they thought it was a wild west out there where NGOs were just chucking money around the world and weren't checking it or following where it went to. So we were able to really demonstrate a strong body of evidence that that wasn't the case. And again, we were also able to show how few the number of instances were of abuse. So the most recent compliance report, which the Charity Commission has compiled on serious incidents in the charity sector, found that only a very small portion, I think about 4% of all incidents affecting charities, were related to terrorism or extremism. So that's not quite the same thing as what the National Risk Assessment was looking at. But you can see 4% of incidents, that's not even actual crimes being committed, but merely suspicions related to this issue. Clearly, it's not that big in the context of the sector as a whole in the UK. So in terms of, if we go to the next slide, the result that we managed to achieve putting this together, we achieved pretty much everything we set out to achieve, to be honest. I mean, we got a better context for NPOs within the National Risk Assessment. So they did state that most charities are small and domestically orientated, and as a consequence were not likely to be abused for money laundering or terrorist financing purposes. They also recognised that charities aren't being set up to abuse the rules because, as we explained to them, frankly, setting up a charity in the UK is a very laborious, time-consuming and expensive job. And if you wanted to launder money, you could do it far more efficiently and quietly if you registered as a private company than if you registered as a charity. So that was reflected in their National Risk Assessment. And of course, once we put that evidence together, they managed to reduce the overall level of risk in the sector from medium, high to low. So that was quite an important win. So moving to the next slide, in terms of things in our favour, because I don't think it was just our work on its own which changed it. We're lucky that in the UK there is a very clearly legally defined structure for charities. So we could point to existing regulations, existing regulators, existing legal cases, and we could put those to government. And as a consequence of that, we were able to put quite a strong evidence base together. If you work in a country where there isn't a strong legal format for NPOs, and it's very similar to private companies, I think that leaves you in a slightly weaker position. So I appreciate we were starting from a pretty strong point. As I said, we also had a number of working groups. We had our counter-terrorism and sanctions working group, our regulator, the Charity Commission was also convening working groups to look at this issue. Banks were convening groups to look at this issue. And we had a number of reports. You probably have read work by people like Tom Keating, who have done work on de-risking in the charity sector. So we had all that evidence. We had Chatham House events. We had the Overseas Development Institute. Everyone was putting together reports on this. So the government was under a lot of pressure to act through the National Risk Assessment. And that wasn't our responsibility. That was a range of organisations. Our regulator, the Charity Commission, was also keen to get things changed, because I think they recognise that things have gone a bit too far. They've often been criticising charities for risk when it came to terrorism, but I think even they would admit that actually they probably over-egged it slightly, and as a consequence they needed to tone the National Risk Assessment down. And also we were lucky that the UK had been one of the countries that had pushed for changes to Recommendation 8, so I think they felt a bit of moral pressure that they had to do a good job of assessing risk in the NPO sector, and they had to take aboard our concerns. So in terms of tips, if you are trying to do your own risk assessment from an NPO perspective, not a government perspective, I think you want to start building networks now about what the impact of de-risking and compliance has been on the NPO sector in your country, and start surveying and gathering case studies and everything that you can on these issues. Even if there isn't a risk assessment in the immediate future, this will all pay dividends later down the line. You need a point of contact to bring this stuff together. So EFG, my organisation, provided that in this case. But this is nobody's day job. So we've all got our day jobs, and somebody has to kind of be a conduit that people feed their information into. Otherwise, it'll never get done. So someone's got to volunteer or find funding to do this work. And also, again, there's no point. Again, my job wasn't actually, or I didn't see it as my job to actually understand the risk that NPOs faced when it came to terrorism or money laundering. Our job was to understand what the government thought the risks were, and then to provide evidence that they weren't as significant as they thought. So don't get bogged down in trying to be perfect or trying to understand all the risks facing your country, because to be honest, they're probably not going to read all the report you put to them or all the evidence you give to them anyway. It's only going to count if you're addressing the real concerns that they already have. So try to understand their point of view and then respond accordingly.
Thanks very much, Andrew. It's very, very, very good presentation, and also from practice, so to speak. So that's really helpful. Kay, are there any questions?
Yes, here is a question. Are there plans to conduct training for interested individuals and organizations on how to conduct the risk assessment? Going, I guess, into more depth and national level planning?
Not as far as I'm aware.
Perhaps any of the others? Okay. Okay, perhaps one of the other speakers would know if there is any training provided on risk assessments for NPOs?
I've
no,
jumped in here.
Not that I'm aware.
I should mention the Global NPO Coalition has done a lot of work, but also there's an expert hub that's been set up. A lot of the Global NPO Coalition members are involved in that. I've been involved in that as well. So there is some further guidance is being provided for countries on how to undertake risk assessments, both at the strategic level and at the specific methodologies that have been provided as well. And that's something that my organisation, Greenacre, has been working on alongside Kay's organisation, Human Security Collective, and the European Centre for Not-for-Profit Law. We are all also involved, along with Kay from Charity and Security Network, in the expert hub, which is I guess Leah may be better placed to actually speak about this than I am, but it's an attempt to try to spread best practices and awareness of these issues and how civil society can respond to that amongst a group of practitioners across the globe. But it's in fairly early stages, that. But I guess that we're hoping to be able to get more support, information out there to individuals around the world who are interested in this and maybe addressing it from their civil society point of view.
Thank you, Ben.
Leah,
that is helpful. Yeah.
Leah, if
Yes?
I may make a contribution add-on to it, to pick up from what Ben has said, I would actually encourage the NPOs to actually get together at the country level via a network or a coalition at the country level or something of that sort. And they can also be proactive on the risk assessment exercise. If they think they need training, they should come up together and probably try to liaise with the global coalition, and the global coalition can either help them find resources or direct them to people or experts that can actually help them build capacity in that respect. But my advice would be for them to get together at country level and be proactive if they think they need training, even before the national risk assessment of the country is initiated.
Thank you. Thank you,
There is
Ben
one more
and Yann. Yeah.
for the
Go ahead,
presenters. From your point of view, which countries have applied a solid methodology to carry out a risk-based approach of the nonprofit sector? If any.
I've been left on screen. I'm happy to answer that question. I think we just had an interesting example there from Andrew in relation to the UK, which I think is, whilst he wasn't speaking about the government's methodology, he was certainly speaking, I think, provided a very solid strategy from civil society's perspective on how they could be, how they can engage in a positive way, both in terms of what the country needs, the government needs, but also in terms of what civil society needs. So I think there's a lot to be learned from what Andrew's just been speaking about. In terms of successful methodologies, I think one of the most striking things so far, when you look at the mutual evaluation reports that have been completed, is that I think only Canada has been found to be fully compliant with recommendation 8. Very, very few countries, and we're including in this many, developed countries in the Western world, very few of them have even attempted to do a proper risk assessment of the sector, or have done it in a way that has satisfied the evaluators. I think one of the few really good examples that I would point to would be Australia, which is online. That was done after their evaluation, so they were actually found non-compliant, but they have since then completed a risk assessment of the NPO sector, and I think that's quite a good, one of the better examples, or probably the best example that I can think of off the top of my head. Andrew, I don't know if you can tell us in the UK whether how much information on the methodology for the risk assessment is online, or where people can find more information on the UK example.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one. Not much information for us. I mean, we'll be publishing our paper shortly that we put forward as part of the national risk assessment, so people can see kind of what we argued for and the evidence that we put forward. But the UK does this, I think, like most countries, it does it in a very secretive fashion. And I often found that many times during the process that they were contradicting themselves about how they were actually running it. So I'm not really in a position to say exactly what the methodology they deployed for measuring NPOs was. I think it was probably a range of stakeholder meetings like the one that we organised, meetings with the Charity Commission, our regulator, and also drawing on their regulatory and compliance cases, and any available legal kind of information that they had on legal cases affecting NGOs in the sector. I don't know how they weighted those. I don't know which they took more seriously. I don't know how they interpreted some of that information. So, for example, the compliance work I was referencing earlier, if there's a serious incident in the charity, so something like a fraud or money laundering, or even the suspicion of that activity, that has to be reported to the regulator. But it doesn't actually mean that anything's gone wrong necessarily. So and again, there's a lot of compliance cases on extremism and terrorism in the UK, but nearly all of them find nothing. A few find something, and then they take those to court. So I don't know how they weight what the risks actually are, and I think some of it is just a question of the perception of risk. And I think between 2015 and 2017, for whatever reason, lobbying from NPOs, changing the regulator, political pressure, they had a slightly different perception of what they thought the real risks facing charities were. I think that was probably one of the biggest differences.
If you wouldn't mind me just jumping.
Last question.
Quickly.
I just want to add there are a lot of sharing the slides and how to get in touch with the coalition. We will be sending all registrants a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, and this webinar will be posted also on www.atfplatform.org, and you can also get in touch with the coalition that way. If you are not on the coalition email list, also let us know and you can be added.
Thank you very much, Kay. I think our time is up, right, with this last announcement of yours, because I saw that Ben wants to react to Andrew's, let's say, answer about how the UK government weighted the risk of NPOs. Dan, would you like to say something about that? And then we close off?
Yes, very quickly then. I would, taking the UK example and extrapolating outwards, a real problem here that a lot of countries are facing when it comes to the methodology is the fact that they are being asked to make assessments based on very rare events. And assessing risk on the basis of very rare events is very difficult. And what seems to be making one recent development when you look at the mutual evaluation reports, which makes it even more complicated, is that some countries which have done risk assessments have been criticized for those assessments on the grounds that there wasn't enough solid evidence backing up their assumption. So where this goes over the next year or two will be fascinating, because I think there's a real methodological problem which an awful lot of countries are facing. And the fact that the information they do use is confidential makes it very hard for anybody from the outside to assess how rigorous the process actually is.
That's a very good point, and I think an excellent point to close this webinar, on the note that there's lots to do when we work together, NPOs collectively, to start strongly engaging on the risk assessment. And sometimes, as all the speakers were saying, the NPOs really need to kickstart this process in their own countries. I do hope that this webinar has given you some food for thought and ideas, but also some points to get into action together. So I would like to thank our speakers, Ben, Yann and Andrew, for their excellent presentations, also for the very good questions raised by you, for Kay, who was handling all the techniques. Thanks for that, Kay. And as Kay already said, the webinar was recorded and will be available on www.fatfplatform.org. And any other questions you may have, please address to us, and we'll just channel the questions to the presenters, who will, I'm sure, get back to you on specific issues you still have after their presentations. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. And for those of you whose weekends are starting, have a very good weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Kay. Bye.